They say memory is a strange thing. That trauma can sharpen some details while blurring others into mist. For me, the day of the accident is burned into my mind with such merciless clarity that even closing my eyes at night does nothing to erase it. I can still smell the metallic tang of blood, still hear the shriek of tires slicing across asphalt, still feel the violent tug of gravity as my body slammed against the dashboard. And I can still hear his voice, my son's voice shaking with panic, crying out for help, begging strangers to save me. For weeks afterward, everyone in town called him a hero. He pulled his mother from the wreckage with his bare hands. That's what the local paper printed under a photo of him standing outside the hospital. Bruises on his face, bandages on his arm, but smiling, soaking in the praise like sunlight. Neighbors brought casseroles. Church ladies clasped my hand with tears in their eyes, and the mayor even sent a card addressed to the brave young man who risked everything for his mother. I smiled for them because what else could I do? I nodded, whispered yes, I'm lucky to be alive, even managed to thank God in front of the pastor. But inside me, beneath the broken ribs and stitched skin, a seed of unease was growing. Something about it never felt right. Something about the way his eyes darted away from mine when people called him a savior. Something about the fact that I had no memory of him pulling me free. I'm 58 years old. My name is Margaret Hale, though most people in our neighborhood just call me Maggie. I've spent most of my life in the small coastal town of Truro, Massachusetts, where gossip spreads faster than the tide, and where everyone thinks they know your family better than you do yourself. I raised my son Daniel mostly on my own after his father left when he was 8. Daniel was my whole world, my reason to keep going through double shifts at the diner, through the humiliation of unpaid bills, through the quiet ache of an empty bed every night. For years, I told myself my sacrifices would pay off. That one day, when he stood tall and successful, I would be able to say, I gave him everything, and look how he turned out. And in a way, that came true. At 26, Daniel had the kind of charm that made people trust him instantly. He was tall, lean with his father's striking green eyes and my stubborn chin. He knew how to talk to anyone from elderly neighbors to wealthy tourists, and he carried himself with the confidence I had never been able to claim for myself. But behind that polished smile, there was always a shadow I tried to ignore. The gambling debts. The sudden disappearances of money from my purse. The lies, small ones at first, then bigger, woven together so tightly I could barely tell where the truth ended and the deception began. And yet, no matter how many times he hurt me, I kept forgiving. Because he was my son. Because every mother wants to believe her child is better than his worst mistakes. The night of the accident, we were driving back from Boston after a tense dinner with his fiancée's family. They were well off, the kind of people who dined under chandeliers and asked pointed questions about one's lineage. I had worn my best dress, the one I saved for Easter service, but I still felt like an imposter. Daniel had been restless all evening, his smile a little too forced, his answers too quick, and when his future father-in-law asked about his job prospects, I saw his jaw tighten. On the way home, the silence between us was thick enough to choke. I remember glancing at him, his hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. I opened my mouth to say something, I don't even remember what, but then the world exploded into chaos. Headlights from the opposite lane swerved into ours. The scream of tires, the bone-rattling impact, glass shattering like gunfire, then nothing but darkness. When I woke in the hospital, the doctors told me I was lucky. Broken ribs, a concussion, deep bruising, but alive. Alive because they said my son had cut through my seatbelt and pulled me free before the car caught fire. They repeated that story so often, it became the official narrative etched into every conversation, every sympathetic glance. But here's what no one knew in the blur before unconsciousness claimed me. I remembered the sharp slice of something cold across my chest. Not the seatbelt pulling me back, but the seatbelt loosening. A snap, a cut, and then the sickening lurch as my body was thrown forward, unrestrained, colliding with the dashboard with crushing force. Weeks later, when the bruises had faded to yellow and the town's excitement dimmed, I asked the doctor for my medical report. It was meant to be routine insurance paperwork, nothing more. But tucked within those clinical pages was a single line that shattered me. Seatbelt had been severed prior to impact. My hand trembled as I traced the words again and again, as if repetition could alter their meaning. Severed prior to impact. Which meant I hadn't been saved. I had been endangered. Someone had cut my seatbelt before the crash, and the only person sitting beside me in that car was my son. For days, I didn't know what to think. Was it possible? Could my Daniel have done something so monstrous? Maybe the doctors were mistaken. Maybe the belt snapped on its own. But then I remembered the debts, the lies, the way he had been eyeing my small life insurance policy after his fiancée pushed him about money. I remembered the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes when the mayor called him a hero. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't eat. I would lie awake at night, listening to his footsteps in the hallway, wondering if each creak of the floorboards carried the weight of a secret darker than I could bear. And yet, every morning, he would bring me tea, ask about my pain, kiss my forehead with that boyish tenderness that had once melted me. If this was guilt, he wore it like a second skin. If this was innocence, then why did my heart race every time he smiled? It took everything in me not to confront him immediately. But I knew if I came at him too directly, he would twist it, turn it, drown me in explanations until I doubted myself. He had always been good at that. Instead, I pretended. I played the grateful mother, the fragile survivor clinging to the image the town adored. Meanwhile, I began to dig. I found the pawn shop receipts hidden in his desk drawer, proof of how he had sold my jewelry weeks before the accident. I discovered he had taken out a payday loan in my name, forging my signature. And then one evening, when he was out, I rifled through his car and found the utility knife tucked beneath the passenger seat, its blade dulled and stained with something dark. I held it in my hand and felt the ground vanish beneath me. That was the moment I knew in my bones what my heart had been trying to deny. My son hadn't saved me. He had tried to kill me. But why for money? For freedom from the burden of me? For the twisted thrill of being seen as a hero? My mind spun in endless circles, searching for logic in a betrayal that defied all logic. The boy I had carried in my womb, nursed at my breast, worked my hands raw to feed. He had cut the very strap meant to protect me and sent me hurtling toward death. I couldn't go to the police, not yet. The evidence was circumstantial. And besides, who would believe me over the beloved town hero? They would say grief was making me paranoid, that trauma was twisting my mind. No, if I was going to reveal the truth, I had to be careful. I had to gather proof strong enough to crush the mask he wore. And so began the most excruciating performance of my life. By day, I let him play the role of devoted son. By night, I kept a secret journal recording every inconsistency, every odd glance, every slip of the tongue. I started visiting the hospital archives, requesting copies of reports, learning about seatbelt mechanics, studying photographs of the wreck. Piece by piece, I began to weave together a tapestry of truth, a damning portrait of the boy who had once been my entire reason for living. But the closer I looked, the more I uncovered secrets that reached beyond the accident itself. Secrets buried so deep, they threatened to rip apart not only my life, but the entire story of our family. The first secret I uncovered wasn't about Daniel directly, but about his father. For years, I had told myself that Richard left because he couldn't handle the grind of our life, that the shame of low wages and overdue bills drove him out of our home and into the arms of someone richer, someone less complicated. It was easier to believe that than to admit I had simply not been enough. But when I started combing through the old insurance papers, I found letters, legal documents Richard had never signed, but had kept tucked away in the back of a manila envelope. They were proposals from a life insurance agent policies, with my name listed as the insured and Richard and Daniel as the beneficiaries. At first, it didn't register. Then I looked at the dates. He had taken the meeting with the insurance agent only 2 weeks before he walked out. My stomach turned. Could it be that Richard's plan had been to profit from me even back then? Had I been nothing more than a dollar sign a policy waiting to be cashed in? Or had Daniel inherited more from his father than just those piercing green eyes? It hurt worse than any broken rib from the crash, realizing the men I loved most had perhaps seen me not as a person, but as a means, as currency. The journal became my lifeline. I wrote in it obsessively, even when my hands ached. I poured out my memories, my suspicions, the evidence I gathered. I described the way Daniel grew quiet whenever bills arrived in the mail, the way he always steered conversations back to money, the way he flinched when I asked about his fiancé's family, pressing him for financial stability. It was all there, a silent witness that if I did not survive long enough to speak the truth, someone else might find. One evening, I caught him watching me write. His expression was unreadable, hovering between curiosity and suspicion. "What are you always scribbling, Mom?" he asked, trying for casual, but his jaw was tight. I laughed it off, called it a gratitude journal the hospital therapist had recommended. He nodded slowly, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. That night, I tucked the journal into a shoebox beneath loose floorboards in my closet. My heart raced as I pressed the wood back in place, my ears straining for the sound of his footsteps. The house felt like a battlefield, every creak and sigh of the old beams charged with tension. I had raised this boy, fed him, sacrificed for him. And now, I was hiding from him in my own home. The second secret came from his fiancée, Lila. She was a sweet girl on the surface, polite, soft-spoken, the kind of young woman who sent thank-you cards and baked pies for neighbors. But when I asked her once about the engagement ring Daniel had given her, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He said it was his grandmother's," she whispered, her eyes flicking toward the door as if afraid he might overhear. "But my friend works at the pawn shop. She told me he bought it secondhand with cash. And 2 days later, your bracelet was gone from the jewelry box you keep in the hutch." I remember gripping the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. That bracelet had been my mother's, the last tangible piece of her I had left. And he had sold it just to buy the illusion of love, to convince a woman to tether her life to his. I asked Lila gently if she ever had doubts about marrying him. She hesitated, then whispered, "Sometimes I think he hides something. He's so charming, but when he looks at me a certain way, I feel like he sees through me. Like I'm not a person, just a role he needs me to play." Her words echoed my own feelings. I had spent years convincing myself that his lies were just missteps, that his betrayals were temporary lapses. But perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps Daniel had never truly seen any of us as real people. Not me, not her, not anyone. The third secret revealed itself at the bank. I went in one afternoon to withdraw money for groceries, only to find that my account was nearly empty. Panic surged through me. I had always been careful, always budgeted down to the last cent. When I asked the teller for a printout of recent transactions, my hands shook so violently I could barely hold the paper. There were withdrawals I hadn't made, transfers to an account I didn't recognize. I demanded to know whose account it was, but the teller, bound by privacy laws, could only shrug. Still, The routing number was there. I copied it down my pen, digging so hard into the receipt that it nearly tore. Later, with the help of an old friend who worked at a different branch, I learned the truth. The account belonged to Daniel. I sat in my car outside the bank, staring at the crumpled printout in my hands. My chest ached, but not from the healing ribs. It was the kind of ache that comes from realizing your entire life has been stolen piece by piece by the one person you trusted most. By then, the evidence was undeniable. He had debts, he had motive, he had lied, he had stolen, and the seatbelt had been cut before the crash. It all led back to him. Still, I wasn't ready to confront him outright. Instead, I decided to test him, to see if under pressure the truth might slip free. One night, as we sat in the living room, I asked softly, "Do you ever think about the accident, Daniel? About how close we came to losing everything?" His eyes flickered to mine, then away. He swallowed hard, forced a smile. "Of course. But we didn't lose everything, Mom. I saved you. That's what matters." I leaned forward, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But what if you hadn't cut me free? What if the seatbelt had held?" For the briefest moment, his face froze. His pupils dilated, his mouth opened slightly, and a shadow of fear passed over him. Then he laughed too loudly, shaking his head. "You must have hit your head harder than we thought. I didn't cut anything. I saved your life." But I saw it. That flicker. That split second of recognition before the mask returned. And I knew. After that night, I became careful to the point of paranoia. I checked the locks twice, sometimes 3 times. I hid the spare keys in places he would never think to look. I started cooking my own meals, declining his offers to bring me tea or soup. The thought that he might try again haunted me. Because if he had failed once, what was to stop him from planning another attempt? And then, just when I thought the weight of this secret would crush me, another revelation came, one that made the ground beneath me crack wide open. I was visiting the courthouse to file routine paperwork for a property tax exemption when I overheard 2 clerks talking about a case involving Daniel's name. My blood ran cold. I waited until they left, then asked another clerk if I could look up recent filings. She frowned, but after some convincing, she pulled the record. It was a petition for guardianship. My son had filed documents claiming I was mentally incompetent after the accident, that my head injury had left me confused, unstable, unable to manage my affairs. He was seeking control of my finances, my property, my life. I remember standing there in that courthouse, the paper trembling in my hand, the words blurring through my tears. It wasn't enough that he had tried to kill me. Now, he was trying to erase me while I was still alive. That night, I sat in the dark of my bedroom, the shoebox with my journal open on the bed. Every page felt like a lifeline, a piece of proof that I was not insane, that my suspicions were grounded in reality. I read through them slowly, one by one, until I reached the last page I had written. My pen hovered, and I wrote, "He is trying to destroy me, but he does not know who I am. He does not know how much strength it takes to survive what I have already endured. If he wants war, he has found it." From that moment, something in me hardened. I was no longer just a mother clinging to denial. I was a woman betrayed, preparing for battle. But battles are not won overnight. They require patience, strategy, sacrifice. And as I set out to expose my son's treachery, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the truth, for every woman who has been silenced, doubted, dismissed, for every mother who gave everything only to have her child sharpen betrayal into a knife. And I would not stop until the world saw him for what he truly was. The morning after I discovered Daniel's guardianship petition, I woke with a clarity that almost frightened me. The fear that had kept me paralyzed for weeks dissolved into something sharper, colder resolve. If he wanted to strip me of my name, my freedom, my very existence, then he would learn that I was not so easily erased. I spent that entire day in preparation. I photocopied every page of my journal, every receipt, every bank statement. I scanned documents at the library and emailed copies to myself under a new account he could not trace. I even slipped an envelope of evidence to my neighbor Alice with instructions to open it if anything ever happens to me. Her brows knit with concern, but I brushed it off with a shaky smile. "Just an old woman being cautious," I said. She didn't push further, but I saw the questions in her eyes. Living with Daniel under the same roof became unbearable. Every gesture of kindness felt like poison. When he asked if I wanted soup, I wondered if he had laced it. When he offered to drive me to the pharmacy, I imagined him steering us into a ditch. The paranoia was exhausting, but I couldn't afford to lower my guard. Not anymore. The first confrontation came sooner than I expected. He returned home one evening, his face flushed, his movements erratic. I recognized the signs he had been gambling again. He slammed his keys on the counter and muttered about bad luck and rigged tables. Then his eyes landed on me, and something in his expression shifted. "Mom," he said slowly, "you trust me, don't you?" It was such a simple question, but it sliced through me like a blade. For years, I had answered without hesitation. Of course, I trusted him he was my son. But now, the words lodged in my throat. "I want to," I whispered finally. His lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good, because things are complicated right now. I need you to sign some papers, just routine stuff, bank things. You know." My pulse hammered. "Bring them to me tomorrow," I said carefully, forcing my voice steady. "I'll look them over." He studied me, suspicion flickering across his face, but then he shrugged. "Fine, tomorrow." He walked away, whistling under his breath, but I knew better. That was no casual request. That was the next move in his game. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced my room, replaying every moment of his life in my mind. His first steps, his scraped knees, the nights I held him as he sobbed after his father left, the promises I whispered into his hair that I would always protect him no matter what. And now, here I was protecting myself from him. The cruel irony of it almost broke me. But grief has a way of hardening into strength when there is no other choice. The next morning, I sought out a lawyer. Not the expensive kind Daniel's fiancé's family might use, but a local woman named Ruth, who had a reputation for fierce advocacy. She listened intently as I laid out my suspicions, her pen scratching across the notepad. I showed her the bank statements, the pawnshop receipts, the guardianship petition. When I hesitated before mentioning the severed seatbelt, she leaned forward. "You don't need to prove every suspicion," she said gently. "You only need to prove enough. We build from there." Her confidence steadied me. For the first time since the accident, I felt less alone. Meanwhile, I kept playing my role at home. I smiled when he called me Mama in that boyish tone he dusted off whenever he wanted something. I pretended to nap when he lingered too long outside my bedroom door. I even praised him at church when neighbors asked about his recovery. Because exposing him would require patience, timing, and I had learned the hard way that rushing could be fatal. The day he brought the papers, I was ready. He slid them across the table, his hands a little too eager, his voice a little too smooth. "Just sign here, Mom. It's nothing big. Just consolidating accounts so I can help you manage bills. You know, like any good son would." I took the papers with trembling hands, adjusted my reading glasses, and pretended to scan them casually. But inside my fury boiled. The pages were dense with legal jargon, but I could make out enough power of attorney financial rights transfer of assets. In one signature, I would have handed him control of everything. "Of course," I said softly, smiling. "Let me take a little more time, darling. I want to read carefully. You taught me that, remember, to always read carefully." For a moment, he stiffened. Then he chuckled, leaned back, and said, "That's my mom." But as he walked away, I caught the flash of frustration in his eyes. Later that week, Ruth confirmed what I already knew. Signing those papers would have left me powerless. "This isn't about helping you," she said grimly. "This is about ownership. He's trying to make you disappear legally before he makes you disappear physically." Her words made me shiver, but they also gave me strength. Because now, I wasn't just fighting shadows and suspicions. I had facts, proof, a plan. Still, part of me clung to hope that I was wrong, that some explanation would surface, some evidence that would redeem him, that the boy I had raised still existed beneath the greed, the lies, the betrayal. That hope died the night I found the second knife. It was hidden in his dresser, tucked beneath a pile of shirts. The blade was newer, sharper still in its packaging. My hands shook as I held it, my breath shallow. There was no reason for him to own it. No reason except the one I dreaded most. I put it back exactly as I found it, my heart thundering. From then on, I slept with a chair wedged beneath my bedroom door. The final straw came when Lila showed up on my porch, tears streaking her face. She clutched her purse as if it contained her very soul. "I can't marry him," she sobbed. "I thought I could change him, but he scares me. He talks about money all the time, about how things would be easier if people just got out of his way. Last night, he said something about you, about how you're not going to be around much longer." I pulled her inside my hands, icy. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Margaret, you need to be careful. He's not the man you think he is." Her words were both a dagger and a bomb. Because I had already known, but hearing it aloud from someone else's lips stripped away the last veil of denial. That night, I wrote the longest entry in my journal. I described the accident in detail, the sound of the cut seatbelt, the doctor's report, the evidence I had gathered, Leila's confession. I wrote until my hand cramped, until tears blurred the ink. And at the end, I wrote, "Tomorrow I stop being his mother. Tomorrow I become his judge." The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A hearing was scheduled for his guardianship petition. He hadn't told me, of course, but Ruth had found the notice and arranged for me to appear. When I walked into that courtroom, Daniel's head snapped up in shock. He hadn't expected me there. He hadn't expected me to fight. I remember the way he looked at me, half fury, half disbelief, as I took my seat beside Ruth. For the first time, he realized I was not the fragile woman he thought he could control. For the first time, he saw that I had teeth, and as the judge called the case to order, I knew that everything, my life, my truth, my survival, would be decided in that room. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and dust, the kind of scent that clings to wood older than memory. I sat there clutching Ruth's hand beneath the table, my heart beat louder than the judge's gavel. Daniel sat across from me, jaw clenched, his suit crisp, his hair slicked back, as if neatness could disguise the rot beneath. He didn't look at me like a son looks at a mother. He looked at me like an opponent, an obstacle. When the judge asked him to state his case, he rose smoothly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who believed the world would bend to his charm. He spoke of my confusion, my forgetfulness since the accident. He said I couldn't handle my finances anymore, that I was vulnerable, that he only wanted to protect me. He played the dutiful son so convincingly that a murmur of sympathy swept through the gallery. But I had been waiting for this moment. When Ruth called me to testify, I stood with trembling legs, but my voice grew steadier with each word. I told the court about the accident, about the doctor's report, about the severed seatbelt. I described the bank withdrawals, the pawned jewelry, the guardianship petition he filed behind my back. I pulled from my bag the photocopied receipts, the journal pages, the documents Ruth had organized into neat folders. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Whispers. Gasps. The judge leaned forward, eyebrows knitting. Daniel's face darkened. He jumped up, interrupting me, his voice louder now, desperate. "She's lying. She's sick. She doesn't know what she's saying." Ruth calmly handed the judge the doctor's report, the bank records, the guardianship filing stamped with Daniel's signature. Silence fell like a stone. I turned, then looked directly at my son. My voice shook, but I forced each word like a blade. "You didn't save me. You cut my seatbelt. You tried to kill me." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Daniel's mask cracked. His mouth opened, then shut. His eyes darted wild, searching for escape. And in that flicker, everyone saw it, the guilt, the fear, the truth. The judge's gavel struck down. This court will not grant guardianship. Further investigation into criminal conduct will proceed immediately. Daniel exploded, shouting, cursing, fighting against the bailiff's grip as they escorted him out. The boy I had once held, the man I had once believed in, was dragged from the courtroom like a stranger. My hands shook, tears burning my cheeks, but I didn't look away. I needed to see it. I needed to let it sear into me, the cost of loving someone who had chosen betrayal over blood. The weeks that followed were a blur. Police came. Investigations opened. Lila gave her statement confirming his debts, his words, his threats. The pawn shop owner testified about the jewelry. The mechanic explained that the seatbelt had been cut deliberately with a blade. Piece by piece, the facade collapsed until nothing remained but the raw truth. Daniel was charged with attempted murder and fraud. The trial dragged on for months. Each day, another wound reopened. Neighbors avoided my gaze, torn between disbelief and pity. Some whispered that I had exaggerated, that mothers shouldn't speak against their sons. But others, women who had lived their own betrayals, who had swallowed their own silence, met my eyes with something fiercer than pity. They met my eyes with recognition. When the guilty verdict finally came, I sat in that courtroom again, older by decades, but steadier. The judge sentenced him, and I listened without flinching. My son, the boy I had nursed, clothed, sacrificed for, would spend years behind bars. Afterward, I walked alone to the pier, the salt air stinging my lungs. I watched the waves crash against the rocks, relentless, endless as they had for centuries. And I let myself grieve, not just for the son I had lost to greed and darkness, but for the illusion I had carried for so long. I had believed love was enough to save him. I had believed my sacrifices could shield him from himself. But love without truth is only a chain. And I had finally broken mine. In time, I learned to live again. I joined a support group for families of incarcerated loved ones. I rebuilt my finances with the help of Ruth and others who cared. I planted a garden in the backyard, something living, something that grew, because I nurtured it, not because it took from me, but because it returned beauty for care. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear his voice as a child calling me Mama. Sometimes I wake with tears on my cheeks, torn between memory and reality. But then I rise, walk to the mirror, and remind myself I survived. I faced the truth, and I chose myself finally over the lies that nearly destroyed me. If you've listened to my story this far, I want you to carry this with you. Love is sacred, but it is not blind. Betrayal can come from the very blood in your veins, but so can strength. Sometimes survival means letting go of the ones you thought you could never live without. Sometimes survival means telling the truth, even when no one wants to hear it. My life will never be the same, but it is mine again. And that is enough. If my story touched you, if you felt the weight of it in your heart, I ask you to share it. Like this video so others know they're not alone. Subscribe to hear more stories that dare to tell the truth, and leave a comment below. I want to know if you've ever faced a betrayal that forced you to find strength you didn't know you had.